Madeline Thornton's voice rang out across the bustling airport terminal, slicing through the noise like a blade. "This black woman has no business being on this plane. People like her are always violent," she shouted, pointing aggressively at the composed woman standing across from her. Her words dripped with entitlement, her tone filled with outrage. "I don't know how she got in this line, but I'm not getting on this flight until she's arrested and removed. She's obviously sneaking her way into first class because she doesn't belong here." Madeline, a white woman accustomed to moving through life with an air of self-importance, stood rigidly, gripping the handle of her designer purse, as if the mere presence of the black woman across from her was an insult to her status. Her manicured nails dug into the leather, her expression twisted in disgust. Her furious, entitled glare darted around, waiting for someone to step in and take her side. The airport was filled with weary travelers, some eager to board their flights, others lost in quiet conversations. But Madeline's outburst changed everything. Heads turned, voices hushed, and an uneasy tension settled over the boarding area. Some passengers exchanged hesitant glances, unsure of whether to intervene or stay silent. Others observed quietly, forming their own judgments. Standing at the center of the chaos was Naomi Bennett, the black woman at the receiving end of Madeline's unwarranted outrage. But Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She didn't need to. Her presence alone spoke volumes. And Madeline Thornton, so sure of her superiority, so confident in her ability to dictate who belonged, had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Naomi Bennett was the very definition of grace under pressure. Intelligent, composed, effortlessly elegant. She had built her success on resilience, not privilege. To the untrained eye, to those who viewed the world through the lens of their own biases, she was just another passenger. And that's exactly how she wanted it. Dressed in a simple yet sophisticated travel outfit, Naomi carried herself with quiet confidence. She had no desire to flaunt her wealth or status. No one on that flight knew who she really was. Not the passengers, not the flight attendants. No one except for a select few board members who rarely saw her in person. For years, Naomi had chosen to remain behind the scenes, allowing others to represent her at corporate meetings while she focused on expanding her empire from afar. But this time, she had returned with a purpose. She wanted to see firsthand how her airline treated its passengers. She wanted to witness the experience of everyday travelers without the influence of her title. Because she had seen it before, how people were treated differently based on how they looked, how they dressed, or how much money others assumed they had. What Madeline Thornton failed to realize was that Naomi Bennett was not just another passenger. She was the one person Madeline should never have underestimated. Madeline Thornton walked through life as if the world belonged to her. Wealthy, privileged, and undeniably arrogant, she had spent years controlling the spaces around her, ensuring that everything and everyone fit into the hierarchy she believed in. The moment she saw Naomi Bennett standing in line, waiting to board the plane, she didn't hesitate. She didn't need a reason. In her mind, Naomi simply didn't belong. Madeline had built an entire existence around the belief that she was superior, that her wealth, her status, and her skin color granted her more rights than others. And people like Naomi, they were meant to stay in their place. They weren't meant to stand in first class. The boarding line moved smoothly as passengers adjusted their bags, checked their tickets, and made last-minute phone calls before stepping onto the plane. But at the front of the line, Madeline stood motionless, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd with an air of entitlement. Then, her gaze landed on Naomi. Naomi's outfit was simple yet elegant. No flashy designer labels, no expensive jewelry, nothing that screamed wealth or exclusivity. And that was all it took. Madeline barely glanced at Naomi's face before making up her mind. To her, Naomi wasn't a first-class passenger. She wasn't someone important. She was an employee who had no business standing in that line. Without hesitation, without a second thought, without even asking a single question, Madeline gave an order. "You," she said sharply, her voice laced with condescension. Naomi turned to face her expression calm and unreadable. "Take these bags and load them properly, and be careful, I don't want scratches on my luggage." There was no question in Madeline's tone, just an expectation, an unshakable belief that Naomi would comply without argument. Passengers nearby froze mid-conversation. Some glanced at each other awkwardly, unsure of whether to intervene or stay out of it. Others looked away, pretending they hadn't heard. No one corrected Madeline. And Naomi? She didn't react the way Madeline expected. There was no hesitation, no flustered confusion, no awkward fumbling. Instead, Naomi simply looked at her, a slight smile forming at the corners of her lips. "I'm a passenger, just like you," she said, her voice calm, even unbothered. Madeline's face twisted in disbelief. A short, dry laugh escaped her lips. "Oh, come on, we both know that's not true." Naomi didn't respond. She simply held her ticket in hand, waiting. Madeline's annoyance turned to impatience. She took a step closer, lowering her voice in a way that only made her tone more venomous. "I don't know what kind of stunt you're trying to pull here, but you're in the wrong line." And in true Madeline fashion, she did what she always did when she wanted something handled. She flagged down an employee. Her hand shot up, and within seconds a flight attendant approached. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" The attendant, a young woman named Sarah, asked cautiously, clearly uneasy about being pulled into the situation. Madeline let out an exaggerated sigh and gestured toward Naomi as if discussing a misplaced item rather than a person. "Yes, actually there is." Passengers nearby pretended not to listen, but their ears were tuned in. "This woman is trying to board first class," Madeline continued, her voice dripping with skepticism. "I don't know how she got here, but I think she's confused." Sarah blinked, her eyes shifting between Naomi's composed expression and Madeline's unwavering arrogance. Slowly, she turned to Naomi. "Ma'am, do you have your boarding pass?" Without a word, Naomi handed it over. Sarah scanned the ticket, checked the seat number, then looked back at Naomi again before turning to Madeline. "She's a first-class passenger, ma'am. Everything checks out." Sarah was young, but she was no stranger to difficult passengers. She recognized Madeline instantly, the kind of frequent flyer who demanded extra perks, filed unnecessary complaints, and expected the world to bend to her will. Madeline's lips parted slightly. "You got to be kidding me," she scoffed. "Well, that just doesn't make sense." Passengers exchanged uneasy glances. The tension in the air thickened. Sarah tightened her grip on the scanner, clearly uncomfortable but remaining professional. "Ma'am, every passenger here has been properly screened. If she's in this line, she has the right to be here." Madeline's face twisted in frustration, but for the first time she realized something. No one was backing her up. The whispers among passengers had shifted. Eyes that had once ignored the situation were now watching her closely, judging. For the first time in a long time, Madeline Thornton wasn't the most powerful person in the room. Madeline Thornton stood with her arms crossed, her frustration boiling over. "No, I don't think it is. I want to speak to a supervisor," she snapped. Sarah hesitated. She could already feel the weight of the situation. "There's no need for that, ma'am. She's a confirmed first-class passenger. If you'll excuse us, we need to continue boarding." Madden stiffened. Sarah had just cut off her authority, denied her the power she was so used to wielding, and that was unacceptable. But before she could snap back, before she could escalate the situation even further, she noticed something. The passengers around her, they were watching, and now it wasn't just unease on their faces. It was judgment, not toward Naomi, toward her. Madeline Thornton despised being embarrassed more than she hated being wrong. With a sharp inhale, she forced a tight-lipped smile. "Fine." Her voice was clipped, sharp, but she backed down, for now. As Naomi turned to board the plane, unfazed and untouched by Madeline's entitled fury, Madeline stared after her, watching. Wait, this wasn't over, not yet, not even close. Because Madeline Thornton wasn't the type to let things go. She was going to make sure Naomi regretted this moment, and the next one, and the next. As the boarding process continued, Madeline stepped onto the plane, her frustration barely concealed beneath her forced, tight-lipped smile. She had just been humiliated at the boarding gate, and she was still seething over it. She had expected Naomi to back down, to move aside like so many others had done before when confronted by her authority. But instead, Naomi had simply stood there, unshaken, untouched. Now, as Madeline moved through the first-class cabin, her eyes scanned the seating arrangement, searching for her assigned seat. When she found it, her stomach twisted into a tight knot. She stopped abruptly, her face paled, then immediately darkened with fury. She was seated right next to Naomi Bennett. For a brief moment, she simply stood there, staring at the seat as if it had personally offended her. Then, before she could stop herself, she let out a dramatic huff, loud enough for everyone around her to hear. "Absolutely not," she snapped. "I refuse to sit here." Heads turned at the sudden outburst. A flight attendant, already sensing trouble, hurried over, her professional smile barely masking the tension in her eyes. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" Madeline crossed her arms tightly, her fingers pressing into her sleeves. "Yes, there is a problem. I'm not sitting next to her," she said, jerking her head toward Naomi. "Have you ever been in a situation where you were treated unfairly? What did you do? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe in standing up for what's right, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story, it's just getting started." Naomi, for her part, didn't even react. She was already seated, adjusting her carry-on beneath the seat in front of her, her expression calm, as if Madeline wasn't even worth acknowledging. The flight attendant blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the blatant hostility. "Ma'am, these are the assigned seats. We can't make last-minute changes unless there's an available alternative," she said evenly. Madeline let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Oh, I think you can make an exception. There is no way I'm spending this flight next to—" She stopped herself, her eyes darting toward Naomi before she could finish whatever sentence she had been about to say. Naomi finally looked up, raising a single eyebrow, waiting. She wasn't angry. She wasn't upset. She wasn't flustered. She just watched, quiet, patient, unbothered. And that made Madeline even angrier. The flight attendant, growing more uncomfortable, spoke again, keeping her tone measured. "I understand your frustration, ma'am, but we're fully booked. We don't have any open seats in first class." Madeline's lips thinned. She turned, scanning the cabin, her entitled mind already searching for a way to bend the situation to her will. But for the first time in a long time, Madeline Thornton wasn't getting what she wanted, and that realization burned. Her sharp eyes darted between passengers, silently demanding someone volunteer to switch seats with her. But the cabin remained still. Silence. Passengers quickly busied themselves with their phones, flipping through in-flight magazines, suddenly absorbed in anything but the scene unfolding before them. No one made eye contact. No one was about to get involved. Madeline wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to being ignored. Her temper flared hotter, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "There has to be another seat. I cannot sit here," she insisted, her voice carrying across the cabin. The flight attendant hesitated before sighing. "Let me check with the crew." Madeline folded her arms even tighter, her nails digging into her skin as she watched the flight attendant disappear toward the front of the cabin. She huffed, glaring at Naomi Bennett, who remained completely unfazed by the entire ordeal. Naomi exhaled slowly, refocusing on her bag, adjusting her belongings with the kind of patience that only made Madeline's blood boil. How could she just sit there, so calm, while Madeline was being so obviously inconvenienced? Moments later, the flight attendant returned, offering an apologetic look. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but as I said, the flight is full. There are no other available first-class seats." Madeline's eyes flashed with irritation. "That's unacceptable," she snapped, her voice rising in frustration. Once again, she turned toward the other passengers. This time she was louder, more forceful. Someone switch with me, please, anyone." Again, silence. Passengers pretended not to hear her, looking out the window, scrolling through their phones, suddenly fascinated by anything other than the entitled woman demanding a seat change. For the first time, Madeline felt something unfamiliar creeping in: powerlessness. Just when it seemed like no one would step up, a voice spoke. "I'll switch." Madeline turned sharply, her eyes locking onto the man across the aisle. He was middle-aged, dressed in a navy suit, his warm eyes steady and unreadable. The flight attendant's shoulders sagged in relief. "That would be very helpful, sir, thank you." A smug smirk crept onto Madeline's face. Of course, someone had finally given in. People always did. The man stood, gathering his things, and Madeline wasted no time. She snatched her carry-on from the overhead bin and slid into her new seat, as far from Naomi as possible. Settling in, she exhaled deeply, her body sinking into the cushioned seat. She had won. Again. Or so she thought. Naomi remained as poised as ever, turning her attention back to her belongings, preparing for the flight as if none of this had ever happened. Madeline clenched her jaw, but she wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The tension between them had shifted into something cold and unspoken. It wasn't loud, not anymore. It was the kind of hostility that simmered beneath the surface, the kind that didn't need words. Madeline had made it clear she wanted Naomi gone, removed, erased from her presence entirely. But Naomi? She wasn't here to fight for space that already belonged to her. As the final boarding announcements played over the intercom, passengers made their last-minute adjustments, slipping their carry-ons into the overhead bins before settling into their seats. As the cabin settled into pre-flight routines, Naomi stood reaching for her luggage. The bin above her seat was already packed, filled with suitcases from early boarders. She didn't make a fuss, didn't sigh in frustration, didn't hesitate. Instead, she scanned the cabin for a nearby compartment with room. It didn't take long to spot one, a nearly empty bin just across from her seat. The only problem? It was directly above Madeline Thornton. Naomi took a breath before stepping forward, lifting her carry-on with ease. It was a logical choice, there was ample space and the bins were shared. It was nothing more than a practical solution to a minor inconvenience. But just as she was about to place her bag inside, a sudden, forceful movement stopped her. Madeline's hand shot out. With an unnecessary amount of force, she snatched Naomi's suitcase from her grip and yanked it down. The bag slammed onto the floor with a loud, jarring thud. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Passengers turned in their seats, eyes widening at the sudden aggression. Some whispered, others sat frozen, unsure whether to intervene. The energy in the cabin shifted instantly. Naomi's suitcase lay at her feet, tossed like it was worthless. Madeline stood above it, her face twisted in disgust, her eyes blazing with something ugly. "Absolutely not," she spat, her voice sharp enough to cut through the air. "You are not putting your things near me." Naomi blinked, staring at Madeline with an unreadable expression. Slowly, deliberately, she bent down, picked up her bag, and dusted it off. Her composure didn't waver. She didn't lash out. She didn't retaliate. She simply stood tall, adjusting the strap of her carry-on with quiet patience. "Madeline," she said, her voice level but firm, "this is a shared cabin. Overhead bins don't belong to individual passengers." Madeline's hands clenched at her sides. Her breathing had grown heavier, more erratic. "I don't care," she snapped. "I don't want your things anywhere near me." Naomi let out a slow breath. "I'm just putting my luggage away, that's all." But Madeline wasn't listening. She was spiraling, because Naomi wasn't backing down, and Madeline couldn't stand that. With a sudden furious screech, Madeline lunged forward. Before anyone could process what was happening, she grabbed Naomi's carry-on with both hands and hurled it forward, violently, aggressively, like she was disposing of something filthy. The suitcase hit the ground with another heavy thud. Louder gasps filled the cabin. Passengers sat in stunned silence. A woman across the aisle put a hand over her mouth in shock. The energy in the cabin shifted even further. It wasn't just discomfort anymore. It was disbelief. But Madeline wasn't done. Naomi bent down once more, retrieving her bag, her patience thinning now. She didn't argue, didn't shout. She simply reached for the handle, and that's when Madeline did the unthinkable. With a furious shriek, Madeline snatched the suitcase again, and this time she threw it off the plane. Passengers sat frozen, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Naomi's carry-on tumbled through the open boarding door, landing with a heavy thud on the jet bridge below. A stunned flight attendant who had just been returning to the cabin stopped mid-step, her jaw slack. A crew member at the gate turned, his eyes darting from the fallen suitcase to Madeline, who stood there, chest heaving, hands shaking wildly. The silence that followed Madeline's reckless, unforgivable act was deafening. Naomi's suitcase lay discarded outside the plane, tossed like garbage. And the passengers, the flight crew, the entire first-class cabin, everyone had seen it. But Madeline, she wasn't sorry. She didn't feel remorse. She didn't feel embarrassed. If anything, the sight of Naomi standing there, still calm, still composed, still refusing to react the way Madeline wanted her to, infuriated her even more. Because Madeline wanted a scene, she wanted Naomi to break. She wanted to see her flustered, humiliated, defeated, and yet Naomi just stood there, unshaken. That was the final straw. Something inside Madeline snapped. With a growl of frustration, she lunged forward. "You need to move," she snapped, shoving her hands toward Naomi in an attempt to push her away from the aisle. But Naomi was done being silent. Before Madeline's hands could make contact, Naomi's arms shot up. Her grip was firm as she caught Madeline by the wrist, stopping her mid-motion. The shift in power was immediate. Madeline's entire demeanor changed. Her eyes widened, realization dawning too late. She had pushed too far. She wasn't in control anymore. Naomi's fingers held Madeline's wrists, firm but not forceful. She wasn't attacking her. She was stopping her. But Madeline's face contorted into something vicious. She yanked at Naomi's grip, her voice rising to a shriek. "Let me go! You're hurting me!" Her sudden outburst was loud enough to be heard across the cabin. That was when the supervisor came rushing in, eyes wide, her face a mix of shock and disbelief. "What is going on here?" Madeline didn't miss a beat. She immediately switched tactics. Her entire body trembled. Her voice turned high-pitched, desperate. She played the victim flawlessly. "She attacked me," Madeline wailed, pointing at Naomi with a dramatic shaking hand. "She grabbed me. She got violent. I was just defending myself. That's why I threw her bag out. She was threatening me." Naomi, still composed, slowly released Madeline's wrists. Her expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes now. "That's not true," Naomi said. The supervisor looked between them, clearly trying to process what had just happened. "Hold on, let's slow down for a second," she said, her voice uncertain. Miss Bennett, did you—" Madeline cut her off before she could even finish. "She's violent," she shouted, her voice shrill with manufactured fear. "She needs to be removed from this plane. Arrest her." Naomi, however, said nothing. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself, because she didn't need to. Within minutes, 2 uniformed security officers boarded the plane. What would you have done in Naomi's shoes? Tell us in the comments below. And if you stand against injustice, hit that subscribe button now. Their expressions remained unreadable as they approached the first-class cabin. The entire plane fell into a tense silence. One of the officers, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, spoke first. "We've been informed there was an incident involving a disruptive passenger," he said, scanning the cabin. His eyes landed on Madeline, who was still playing the part of the terrified victim, hands shaking for dramatic effect. "Yes, officer," Madeline blurted out, her voice breathless, trembling. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Naomi. "She threatened me. She got violent. She grabbed me." I don't feel safe sitting here." Naomi remained still, her expression entirely unreadable. The security officer turned toward her, his expression neutral but firm. "Ma'am, is that true?" The weight of Madeline's accusation hung heavy in the air. The passengers held their breath, because in that moment, everything was about to change. The cabin was thick with silence, the tension suffocating. Passengers sat frozen, their eyes darting between the two women, uncertainty creeping into their expressions. Naomi remained poised, her hands resting gently on her lap. She refused to shrink under the scrutiny, watching everything unfold with the same quiet dignity she had maintained all along. Madeline, however, was far from calm. The moment she saw the security officers step in, her confidence surged back. Her breath was still uneven from her fake tears, but she straightened her posture, turning her full attention to them, her supposed allies. "She was aggressive," Madeline exclaimed, her voice trembling just enough to sell the performance. "She grabbed me and wouldn't stop. I was terrified. That's why I had to defend myself." It was a masterful act, and it was working. The security officer nodded firmly, his expression serious as he looked back at Naomi. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us." A few passengers gasped audibly. Others shifted uncomfortably, their faces twisting in disbelief. Some, who had missed parts of the argument earlier, now assumed the worst. Naomi remained silent. She didn't argue, she didn't plead her case, because she knew something Madeline didn't. The lead security officer gestured for Naomi to stand. "We're going to need to remove you from the flight, ma'am," he repeated. Madeline folded her arms across her chest, her expression smug. She had won. Or so she thought. Just as the security officer reached for his radio to call for backup, a voice cut through the cabin like a blade. "That won't be necessary." The entire cabin went still. Heads turned, passengers craning their necks to see where the voice had come from. And there, stepping onto the plane with effortless authority, was a sharply dressed airline executive. Behind him stood two more high-ranking officials, their faces unreadable, their presence alone sending a shockwave through the first-class cabin. A thick, uncomfortable silence settled over the plane. Passengers who had moments ago been uncertain of what to think were now gripping the armrests of their seats, watching with bated breath. The lead executive took a step forward, his sharp eyes shifting from the security officers to Naomi. Then, with a calm, steady voice, he spoke the words that made the entire plane hold its breath. "Ms. Bennett, I deeply apologize. We had no idea you were on this flight." A ripple of gasps swept through the cabin. Passengers sat up straighter, eyes widening. Some exchanged shocked glances. Others simply stared, struggling to process what they had just heard. But no reaction was as noticeable as Madeline Thornton's. Her face went ghostly pale, her posture stiffened, a cold sweat crept up her spine. That name, Naomi Bennett, it rang in her ears like a warning bell. "Ms. Bennett?" Madeline stammered, her voice unsteady. Her gaze snapped between Naomi and the executive, confusion and panic colliding in her mind. "Wait, what?" she whispered, her throat dry. Who is she?" The executive's piercing gaze shifted to Madeline, and for the first time since she boarded this flight, Madeline felt something she wasn't used to feeling. Fear. His expression was stone cold. "You just harassed and attempted to remove the CEO and chief board member of this airline from her own flight." Dead silence. Madeline's heart stopped. Passengers erupted into hushed whispers, turning toward Naomi with fresh, stunned expressions. "The CEO?" one woman gasped. "She owns this airline?" Another man muttered in disbelief. "No way! Oh my God!" someone else whispered. "She's literally the CEO." Madeline's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her thoughts scrambled for an escape, a justification, an excuse, but nothing came. She had spent the last hour trying to assert her power over a woman who had more power than she could ever dream of. And now, everyone knew it. Madeline felt their eyes on her, not in admiration, not in sympathy, but in judgment. Passengers who had ignored the situation earlier were now fully engaged. People who had quietly agreed with Madeline's behavior were now pretending they hadn't, because nobody wanted to be on the wrong side of history. Madeline's breath was shaky as she desperately tried to regain control. She stammered, but the truth had already spoken. I didn't know, Madeline Thornton blurted out, her voice suddenly much smaller, weaker. I thought... But before she could finish, Naomi Bennett stood. For the first time since Madeline had tried to push her, since she had lied, since she had thrown her bag off the plane, Naomi rose from her seat with absolute control. And then she looked Madeline directly in the eye. The entire plane was watching. Naomi only said one thing. That's exactly the problem. Madeline's lips parted slightly. Naomi's gaze never wavered. You didn't know, she said, but you assumed. The crowd, which had gathered closer now, murmured in agreement. Faces that had been neutral before now carried visible disapproval toward the woman. The same people who had remained silent before, too polite, too afraid of causing a scene, now stood witness, their silence heavy with judgment. Elena, who had remained still, felt the tension shift, not onto her, but away from her. She looked down briefly at Lily, whose eyes were wide, absorbing every moment. Elena knew this was a lesson her daughter would carry, a lesson about dignity, about cruelty, and about standing firm. The woman, her composure crumbling, tried to gather her pride. I didn't mean, she began, her voice faltering. It doesn't matter what you meant, Jonathan cut in, his voice like steel. It matters what you did, and it matters that a child saw it. His gaze flicked briefly to Lily before returning to the woman. You had a chance to be better, and you chose otherwise. The color drained from her face, her confidence shattered under the sheer weight of her exposure. She faltered, her voice cracking into something small and unfamiliar. Shame. Without another word, she turned, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor as she hurried from the store. Her presence retreated as quickly as it had struck. A beat of silence followed her departure. Then, slowly, the sounds of the store returned. Beeping scanners, soft conversations, the rustle of bags. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the air. A woman nearby, holding a toddler in her cart, smiled softly at Elena. Good for you. The cashier, still at her station, offered a quiet, You handled that with more grace than most ever could. The older man from the canned goods aisle gave Elena a respectful nod as he passed, his eyes warm with approval. But Elena, though she felt the shift around her, kept her gaze where it mattered most, on Lily. Her daughter's eyes, wide with understanding, met hers. See, Mommy? Lily said softly, her voice full of wonder. You were strong. You didn't need to be loud. You were strong the whole time. Elena's throat tightened. She crouched to her daughter's level and placed a gentle hand on her cheek. Being strong, she said softly, isn't about fighting. It's about knowing who you are and never letting anyone change that. Lily smiled, a bright, pure smile that seemed to fill every corner of Elena's heart. Jonathan, watching the exchange, felt a rare warmth settle in his chest. It was a feeling he cherished, the reminder of why he had built what he had. Not for wealth, not for power, but for people. For the lives that moved unseen through the world, carrying burdens the privileged rarely understood. As Elena straightened, Jonathan met her gaze once more. Elena, he said, his voice gentler now, I have an opportunity, one I think you might be perfect for. Elena's brows lifted slightly. Opportunity? She echoed, cautious but listening. At my foundation, Jonathan explained, we run a community initiative and we're expanding it. We need someone with real experience, someone who understands people, who understands dignity, someone like you. Elena blinked, her guarded expression slipping into something raw and surprised. She hesitated, her voice soft with disbelief. I'm not sure "You are," Jonathan interrupted, his voice firm but kind. "I've seen it today, I saw it." And then he added, his smile tilting warmly, "The position comes with a significant salary increase and flexible hours, so you can be home with Lily." Elena felt the floor shift beneath her. Not from fear, but from possibility. Real, tangible possibility. Her heart pounded and her eyes for a moment threatened to blur. She felt Lily's small hand squeeze hers. Her voice, when it came, was soft but certain. "I'd love to be a part of it." Jonathan's smile deepened. "Good," he said simply. "Welcome aboard." The moment, profound in its simplicity, settled like sunlight breaking through a clouded sky. As Jonathan turned to leave, giving them space, Elena felt Lily tug on her hand. "Mommy?" Lily asked, her voice bright with innocence and hope. "Can we still get the honey next time?" Elena laughed softly, her heart full, her eyes warm. "Yes, baby," she said, pressing a kiss against her daughter's forehead. "Next time, we'll get the honey." They left the store, hand in hand, stepping out into the golden afternoon, where the warmth of the sun matched the fullness in Elena's heart. Behind them the echoes of the day remained, not in the sharp clicks of heels or cold words spoken in cruelty, but in the silent lessons left behind. And as for the wealthy woman, perhaps for the first time in a long while, she had something real to think about. Perhaps, just perhaps, the mirror that Jonathan Hayes had held before her would linger longer than her wounded pride. But Elena did not walk with the weight of another's shame. She walked with the fullness of her daughter's pride, the promise of a new beginning, and the unshakable strength of knowing that dignity, once kept, was the richest treasure of all. And Lily, skipping lightly beside her, carried something just as precious, a lesson not in wealth, but in worth, a lesson in what it truly meant to be strong. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful and inspiring tales. Share this video with your friends to spread the message, and check out our other videos for more stories that will move and inspire you. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.